We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
we're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Offence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good afternoon and welcome to the Briefing PM, an hour of the latest political news, debate and analysis here on GB News. I'm Darren McCaffrey and here's what's coming up over the next hour. The UK is set for a protocol showdown with the European Union as the government unveils its plans to overrule certain aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol. We'll be speaking to Tom Harwood on that and lots more in the next couple of minutes. Nicola Sturgeon has unleashed a new independence campaign, saying it's time for Scotland to realise its full potential. We'll get the latest north of the border. And today marks 40 years since war in the Falklands. We'll be getting the latest from Staffordshire, where a memorial service has been held. And the big political story today, the migrant flight to Rwanda is set to leave a little later, but how many people will be on board? We'll be talking to Anne Whitcomb about that later. And as always, do get in touch with your views. You know the email address by now. It's gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet me at gbnews. A busy programme between now and 4 o'clock. But first, at the top of the hour, here's the very latest news with Rosie Wright.
A very good afternoon to you. It's just 1 minute past 3. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The Supreme Court has ruled that the first flight carrying asylum seekers to Rwanda can go ahead as planned this evening. It's after senior judges dismissed campaigners' attempts to get an injunction to stop it and denied permission to appeal the decision. The Supreme Court also refused to hear an appeal by an asylum seeker who's due on board tonight's flight. The court's president said if the government's policy is found to be unlawful, migrants will be brought back to the UK. The Prime Minister says he always knew it would be a long process.
When I first announced the policy, I said it would take a long time to get going and there would be plenty of legal challenges, there would be bumps on the road. But I think what opponents of the policy have to say is, well, what is your alternative? What is your alternative to people being shipped across the channel in very frail, unseaworthy dinghies, risking their lives and undermining the rule of law?
Scotland's First Minister says there's an indisputable mandate for a second referendum on Scotland's independence from the United Kingdom. Speaking in Edinburgh, Nicola Sturgeon said it would allow for a wealthier, fairer and more resilient nation, adding people in her country are suffering from many implications of a Brexit they did not vote for. Scotland previously held a referendum in 2014 on the issue, where 55% of the country voted against independence. But Ms Sturgeon says the country is more prepared now than it was then.
After everything that has happened, Brexit, COVID, Boris Johnson, it is time to set out a different and better vision. It is time to talk about making Scotland wealthier and fairer. It is time to talk about independence and then to make the choice.
The Foreign Secretary says the EU has absolutely no reason to retaliate against government plans to override the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's threatened legal action if the changes go ahead. Ireland's Foreign Affairs Minister, Simon Coveney, warned it could destabilise peace in Northern Ireland. The government claims the new rules will make it easier for goods to travel there from Great Britain. Liz Truss told GBNews the important thing is to restore the Good Friday Agreement.
We do need to resolve these issues, but we're doing it in a way that doesn't harm the European Union. We're still making sure the single market is protected. We're still making sure north-south trade is protected. So there really is no reason for a negative reaction from the EU from what we're doing.
The names of all the 72 victims of the Grenfell Tower disaster have been read out at a memorial service at Westminster Abbey this morning to mark the 5th anniversary of the blaze. Residents, survivors and bereaved families attended alongside the London Mayor and political leaders. A 72-second silence has also been observed at Westfield Shopping Centre in West London. This evening, members of the community will take a silent walk starting from the base of the tower block. They'll be joined by firefighters from across the country. Downing Street is accusing rail unions of moving forward with industrial action without proper negotiations. It's ahead of 3 days of national rail strikes planned for next week, threatening to cause even more travel disruption for passengers. As more than 6,000 Network Rail staff are now going to be balloted for a set of new strikes in disputes over pay and conditions, the government says it's doing everything possible to encourage unions to step back. The SNP MP, Patrick Grady, faces a 2-day common suspension for breaching Parliament's sexual misconduct policy. He's accused of an unwanted sexual advance to a junior staff member in a pub in 2016. The independent expert panel, which is a parliamentary watchdog, says his behaviour marked a significant breach of the safeguarding policy, but recommended a short suspension. The number of UK workers on payroll rose by 90,000 between April and May to now 29.6 million. Wages, though, have fallen by 4.5%. That's the biggest drop in more than 2 decades. Data from the ONS shows that while employment is rising, it remains below pre-pandemic levels. Veterans of the Falklands War will mark the 40th anniversary of the end of the conflict with a service today. On this day in 1982, the Argentinians surrendered after weeks of fighting. 255 British troops were killed. The Royal British Legion has invited thousands of veterans and bereaved family members to the event at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. You're up to date now on GB News, and I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to the briefing with Darren.
Thank you very much indeed, Rosie. It is 6 minutes past 3 o'clock on this Tuesday afternoon. We're on TV, online and on your DAB digital radios. Thank you very much indeed for your company. It's been a busy day today in the world of politics. The first migrant flight is set to take off later after the High Court of Justice overruled an appeal to stop it flying yesterday. But there are questions about precisely how many people will be on board. Meanwhile, in Scotland, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, held a press conference launching a new campaign for independence, while the Prime Minister's been in Staffordshire at a 40 years Falklands memorial service, where he was quizzed on all these issues. Let's have a listen in.
We always said that this was going to be a long process. If you remember when I first announced the policy, I said it would take a long time to get going. There would be plenty of legal challenges, there would be bumps on the road. But I think what opponents of the policy have to say is, well, what is your alternative? What is your alternative to people being shipped across the channel in very frail, unseaworthy dinghies, risking their lives and undermining the rule of law? What's your alternative? We think it's a sensible partnership we've set up with Rwanda. Yes, it may take a while to get working properly, but it doesn't mean we're not going to keep going.
Hundreds more have arrived today. Clearly, from the people trafficking point of view, it's worth the risk, isn't it? If only a tiny handful are going to be going in the very near future, perhaps into the medium term?
I think it's very important that we continue to show the people traffickers that their business case is going to lead, is being undermined, and that they're cheating people. And they're not only risking their lives, sending them across the sea in unseaworthy vessels, as I say, but they're also running the risk of them being sent to another country which they hadn't bargained for, and they're fundamentally ripping them off. And that's the message we need to get across to those people traffickers.
You predicted yourself that there would be all these legal challenges, and true enough, here we're seeing them. Is it not time to come out of the European Convention of Human Rights to be able to set your own rules, to stack the odds in your favour then when these legal challenges come about? There's
certainly the case that the legal fraternity, sorority, whatever, the legal world is very good at picking up ways of trying to stop the government from upholding what we think is a sensible law, and we're trying to make a distinction between legal pathways to the UK, which we support. We want people to be able to come here in fear of their lives, but we want them to do it legally and safely. And that's why we have all the safe and legal routes that are open to people. What we want to do is to show the people traffickers that they're breaking the law, they're risking people's lives, and it won't work anyway. Now, will it be necessary to change some laws to help us as we go along? It may very well be, and all these options are under constant review.
Can I just ask you about the potential for a Scottish referendum on independence? I know you were speaking to the Scottish First Minister today. She believes there is now an indisputable mandate for a second referendum. She wants it to be lawful. Will you grant her a Section 30 order for a referendum?
Look, I think that the decision was taken by the Scottish people only a few years ago. In recent memory, I think we should respect that. We should also focus on what I think the people of the whole of the UK, Scotland, England, everybody wants us to look at, which is the economic position we're in, the effect of COVID on the country, and then the post-COVID issues that we're grappling with. That's the focus of the government. We're working with our friends in the Scottish government, in the Scottish administration, on those issues, and that's what you'd expect the government to do.
The Prime Minister speaking a little bit earlier on in Staffordshire. In the studio is our political correspondent, Tom Harwood. Tom, good afternoon to you. Let's start, first of all, off with Rwanda. We've had a whole series of court cases again today. Do we know how many people are going to be on that flight later?
Well, we know at least one will be. And fundamentally...
we should say this is not a commercial flight. It's not the government have bought seats. This is an entire plane.
This is a chartered plane, so costing pretty much quite a lot of money for the taxpayer, we can assume. But the government confirmed earlier today in a briefing with journalists that even if just one person was on this particular flight, it would be worth sending off. This is a totemic point of policy and something that the government really wants to get going now, to banish the naysayers, to do down the critics, and to say, well, this is actually a scheme that can work even if it's just one individual. Now, we know that it's probably going to be in single figures, the number on this flight. We don't know quite the number yet because there are all of these individual challenges that are taking place. Yesterday, the government had a victory in court, which was the plane itself is allowed to take off. But it's not just whether the plane goes. Each individual on that flight has their own legal case, their own legal battle, and their own legal representation. At every corner of this policy, at every twist, at every turn, there's been fierce opposition from the legal profession. And so I think the government may well see, even though it's fairly farcical to send one individual on a plane halfway around the world, the government might, in a funny way, see it as a sort of victory that at least they can get the beginning of this policy going.
Well, isn't that the point in many ways? And we heard from archbishops today railing against as well. We believe Prince Charles is not a big fan of it, but this is a fight the government are not even just prepared to have, almost are quite happy to have politically.
Certainly, this is about the government looking and indeed acting tough on illegal migration. Now, in a funny sort of way, this is quite a Blairite policy. Because if we remember back to how Tony Blair opened the doors to legal migration, but was fairly tough on those seeking asylum, tough language at the very least, if not policy, towards those arriving illegally. And I think broadly there is a wide consensus now growing in the United Kingdom. Now that we have control over every element of migration policy, we don't have an open door to anyone. What we have is a controlled drawbridge, not one that's put up, but one that allows numbers that are controlled.
When you look at the figures, quite the opposite in many
Quite the opposite. The numbers of migrants who have been coming to the United Kingdom post-2016 has grown. More people coming this year than before the referendum. But the crucial difference is the type of people coming has changed. They tend to be higher skilled, they tend to speak English, they tend to be easier to integrate. And indeed, in some cases, for example, the British national overseas passport holders from Hong Kong, hundreds of thousands of whom who have come, they have a great affinity towards this country. To some extent, what we've seen is a political consensus draw around the kind of migration that we have, which means people who play by the rules and frankly appreciate this country are broadly welcomed across the political spectrum. Where the government sees a less welcoming attitude is to those who break the rules, those who don't play by them and want to, in effect, jump the queue. And that's where the tough policy comes in.
But it may be one of the reasons, of course, that we're struggling to fill jobs like fruit pickers and also people who work in baggage handling, etc. But we'll see, and it's going to play out, and this is not an issue that's going to go away. A bit like the next issue we're going to talk about, which is, of course, Scottish independence, back up the political agenda today. Nicola Sturgeon determined to have this referendum next year, though it, frankly, at least from sitting here, seems pretty unlikely.
It seems unlikely for one reason, which is that the government of the United Kingdom is the government that can decide whether a constitutional referendum goes ahead or not. That's a competency that remains with Westminster. Now, what happened in 2014, actually, the agreement was 2 years before then, in 2012, with Alex Salmond and David Cameron, and they signed an accord that would lay out the terms of that referendum. They were in incredibly generous terms to Scotland. Alex Salmond got basically everything he asked for because David Cameron was so keen to have this referendum seen as fair, as open, as transparent as possible. Alex Salmond asked for votes at 16. He got that. Alex Salmond asked for people who were resident in Scotland to vote, not just those who were British citizens. He got that. Alex Salmond asked for a 2-year-long referendum campaign, not one that was held pretty quickly and pretty sharply. He got that as well. On all of these issues, Alex Salmond got everything he asked for and yet still lost by 10 points. Now, that's the argument that the government comes to the SNP with, saying everyone said before this referendum it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And last time I checked, 2014 was not a generation ago, no matter how young people are having children these days.
Indeed, though, of course, I think the Scottish Nationals argue that Brexit is a material change in all of that. Talking about Brexit, let's finally talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol. Fascinating, isn't it? We're talking today about Rwanda, Scottish independence and the Northern Ireland Protocol. All issues the government, after weeks of flux, actually would prefer to talk about, in the sense these are battles they think are quite popular. But what is the sense of where we're at with this? Because it could still lead to divisions, couldn't it, within the Conservative Party? There are a section of the Conservative Party who are uncomfortable with this legislation.
There certainly are. However, on the other hand, there's clearly a problem with how the protocol is being implemented as things stand. There's clearly a loss of community consent in at least one community in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland currently does not have an executive. It does not have a government. In that sense, the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement are not working. So that's the government's reason why they are bringing forward this legislation. And let's be real about what the legislation does, which is as soon as it's passed, nothing changes. The legislation gives powers to ministers to implement a new regime. That would then be in the gift of the government. So it doesn't immediately change anything.
But it would be unilateral.
It would be unilateral. And the government published legal advice yesterday trying to explain its own legal position. It believes that unilateral action can be justifiable within the law because of the extenuating circumstances of the risks in Northern Ireland to community cohesion, to peace and everything else, that they have a higher obligation to other international law. So the government's lawyers seem to be putting forward a case that this is legal under international law. The EU disagree, although interestingly, America, which has always been seen as this sort of arbiter in the case of the Good Friday Agreement, has always been seen as a very interested party in all of these discussions. The United States of America saying that this currently, what the government is doing, wouldn't jeopardise UK-US relations and wouldn't jeopardise a UK-US trade agreement even. So it looks like the government is walking this tightrope, potentially not over the cliff just yet.
Well, we'll see. Tom, as always, thank you very much indeed. Tom Howard there, our political correspondent in the studio. Let's go from London to Brussels, get the view from the EU. Speak to Jack Parrock, who is there for us. Jack, good afternoon to you. What is the view? What has the EU said in reaction to all of this in the last 24 hours or so?
Frankly, Darren, the reaction has been a hard no. But that is entirely what we were expecting as we started to hear that this bill was coming. European ministers have come out, and specifically the Irish ministers. Generally, the other countries tend to sort of back behind what the Irish are saying at the moment, just saying that this is simply not acceptable. Yesterday, interestingly, Maroš Šefčovič, who's the vice president of the European Commission and their sort of Brexit commissioner, when the bill was being tabled, it was meant to be tabled at one point in the evening, and he had scheduled a press conference to come out and speak about 20 minutes after it was meant to be proposed in the Parliament in Britain. There was a delay yesterday, but he just came out anyway and did his press conference saying the statements that he wanted, that the protocol is not renegotiable and that they're looking into not just the infringement procedures that they might have had in place already, but additional ones as well. I think the reason I bring up that timing is to show that actually, from an EU side, they're done with this. They're coming out, they know their position, they feel they have unity among the EU member states, and they are simply saying to the British government that they do not accept this bill to change the protocol that they say, and well, it did happen, that the UK government agreed with them as part of the Brexit deal.
Indeed, and that is undoubtedly true. Many would point to the fact that it's not been working. What next, though, for the EU, in the sense we talk about legal action? There's much talk here about a kind of trade war. Do you think that seems unlikely, though, Jack, given the fact that all economies in Europe are under an awful lot of pressure at the moment because of inflation, the war in Ukraine, that neither side essentially can afford a trade war?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think this is going to be a bit of a litmus test between exactly, how far the European Union is willing to go when the disputes come up over the Brexit deal. I doubt that this will be the last one that we see. So what happened is back in March 2021, you'll remember, Darren, there was legal infringements that started to be penned in the European Commission when the British government started to proposing that they would extend grace periods on certain products that were travelling in and out of the EU single market. And the UK wanted to do that unilaterally as well. So the Commission started penning these legal infringements. They say they froze them in September of 2021 in order to try and negotiate through that, which they did manage to go forward on that. Now they're saying that they'll simply unfreeze those legal infringement procedures and potentially will add new ones. The question is, what will those new ones be? And I think most of us in the press pack in Brussels have been plugging every single contact that we have to find out exactly what they're talking about. How far might they go on targeted measures against particular products in the UK coming into the EU single market if this were to be something that comes to pass? But at the moment, it's like getting blood out of a stone. Nobody wants to talk about exactly what that will mean. And that is partly, Darren, because they know, as Tom was saying just now, there's a long way to go on this. There's a lot of dissent in the Parliament. There's questions about whether it will make it through the House of Lords, this bill as it is. So from an EU side, they don't want to show their hand too soon on this.
Jack, as always, great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Jack Parrock there joining us from Brussels. Thank you, Jack. OK, you're watching GB News. We're going to take a quick break. Coming up in just a couple of minutes, we're going to talk about Scottish independence, Nicola Sturgeon's Indie push, and Anne Whittaker will be joining us talking about those Rwanda flights and migration. Stay tuned. We'll see you in just a couple of minutes.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV, on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
Very welcome back. We're just going to go now to Staffordshire, where the Prime Minister is speaking at a memorial service marking 40 years on from the Falklands War. Let's have a little listen.
Liberate a British territory from occupation, and even more importantly, to vindicate the principle that the people of the Falkland Islands, like people everywhere, have a right to decide their own future and live peacefully in their own land. You left behind 255 British service personnel who laid down their lives for that principle, along with 3 Falkland Islanders. As we honour their memory, the greatest tribute we can pay them is that ever since the liberation, the Falkland Islands have lived and thrived in peace and freedom. Today, they are the home to people of 60 nationalities, providing Britain's gateway to the Antarctic and vital opportunities for conservation and scientific research based on a modern partnership founded on that principle of self-determination. None of this would have happened without the tenacity, courage, and fortitude of everyone who served in the task force, and the thousands of civilians who made it possible. Now, in honour of your achievements and sacrifice, I would like to ask the Honourable Roger Spink and the Honourable Leona Roberts of the Falkland Islands Government to present Tom Herring, the Chairman of the South Atlantic Medal Association, with a scroll giving all holders of the South Atlantic Medal the freedom of the Falkland Islands. Thank you very much.
A spectacular fly-past and sequence, including helicopters from the Army Air Corps, Royal Air Force, the Commando Helicopter Force of the Royal Navy and the Royal Navy, flying over the National Memorial Arboretum as the Prime Minister concluded his speech.
There you go, that's the Prime Minister speaking at the National Arboretum in Staffordshire, where people are remembering 40 years since the liberation of the Falkland Islands after that Argentinian invasion back in 1982. And in fact, we'll be going to Mark White, our Home Affairs editor, who is there a little later on in the programme. But first, let's return back to politics here, and the first migrant flight to Rwanda could happen later on today. How many people will be on it? Let's speak to the Deputy Political Editor of The Sun, Kate Ferguson, who joins us live from Westminster. Kate, very good afternoon to you. You've been following this, I assume, all day today. We still don't know whether the plane's actually going to take off.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big story that all of the lobby, and I imagine much of the country, have been glued to. Is this flight going to take off later this evening? But more importantly, if it does, looks like it probably will, how many people will be on it? I think we're down to 7 people meant to be on that flight. We started with 131 and now down to just a handful, and that's because of all these illegal challenges that have been lodged. Every illegal immigrant on that flight has got an army of lawyers behind them, lobbying, making the case that they should stay here, appeal the case, and not be put on that flight. So this is obviously the government's flagship policy, but whether or not it will get off the ground with a single person on that flight is yet to be seen.
Taking it off, getting it off the ground. This faces a lot of opposition, hasn't it, Kate, from some Conservative MPs, the opposition parties. Church of England have been quite vocal on it. Archbishops today writing a letter to the Times newspaper. Even apparently Prince Charles is not in favour of it. But frankly, as you say, this is a political argument. This is a row the government is very prepared to have.
This is Boris's and Priti Patel's flagship borders policy. And Boris Johnson, again, up today, making the case for it, saying it's crucial that we smash those people smuggling gangs. And if you don't like this option, well, what's your alternative? Nothing else seems to be working. And those numbers coming across on the small boats over the channel are getting higher and higher. But you're right, I mean, it's astonishing, really, some of the people we've seen speak out about it. You've obviously had the bishops. We're quite used to them speaking out, probably. But those explosive comments by Prince Charles reported in the papers over the weekend that he thought the scheme was appalling is really remarkable for a king in waiting. And the pair are probably going to have a bit of an awkward encounter next week when both Boris Johnson and Prince Charles are in Rwanda for the Commonwealth Summit. I imagine they're going to have a bit of an awkward conversation on the fringes of that.
The problem for the government in many regards is that this is all predicated, of course, on it being a deterrent, if you like, this policy. And yet, it's been much talked about, hasn't it, for the last 3, 4, 5 months or so. But thousands are still crossing that channel. At the very essence, at least the idea of the policy doesn't seem to have worked thus far.
Yeah, I mean, the whole point of this policy, you're entirely right, is it's meant to be a deterrent. And we saw the Home Office this week launch a big advertising blitz on social media over in France, basically telling migrants over there who are thinking of crossing the channel, don't, because you could be shipped off somewhere else. It hasn't led to a fall in numbers. We've had more come over today. You can probably see where I am. It's scorching hot. When the weather's hot and the seas are calm, you get higher numbers on dinghies crossing the channel. I don't think this will be a deterrent until you see the first people over in Rwanda in that hotel. I think it will certainly need a few months for us to be able to judge how successful it's been. Are numbers coming down, and are people being flown over to actually stay in Rwanda, or are the lawyers winning all the arguments?
And just very finally, Kate, is there a sense that in some ways the government have got to wrestle back a bit more control of the news agenda this week? Talk about Northern Ireland Protocol, about Rwanda, about the issues that they want to focus on. That this week's going, unsurprisingly, maybe a hell of a lot better than last week.
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously had about 6 months of Tory psychodrama. Will there be a confidence vote against Boris Johnson? What Partygate revelations will come out? Last Monday, we had that kind of hectic day when you had that confidence vote and Boris won it, although only marginally. But that means that the rebels can't move against him now for another year. So I think you're right. We're seeing policy take the centre stage now in politics, which we haven't seen for a little while. And I think you'll see that for the next few months, really. Boris going on a policy blitz, promising to try and solve the cost of living crisis. He's talked about housing, he's talking about immigration, he's talking about what he's going to be doing for the economy. That is where Boris wants to be having the conversations. And I think he will get his chance to have those conversations over the next few months. No doubt the knives will come out for him again, but he's got that respite now in order to try and win back his party and, of course, the country.
Kate, as always, thank you very much indeed for your time this afternoon. A very sunny Westminster. Kate Ferguson there joining us down the line. Thank you very much. You're watching GB News just after 3:30. We're going to be talking to Anne Whitaker, the former Home Office Minister, about all of this in just a couple of minutes. Also talking about Scottish independence, and indeed we'll be live in Staffordshire with the memorial there to the Falklands. That and much more in the next 30 minutes. But first, let's bring you up to date with the latest news. It's back to Rosie.
It's 3:32. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date. Now, the Supreme Court has ruled the first flight carrying asylum seekers to Rwanda can go ahead as planned this evening. It's after senior judges dismissed campaigners' attempts to get an injunction to stop it and denied permission to appeal the decision. The Supreme Court's also refused to hear an appeal by one asylum seeker who's due on board tonight's flight. The court's president says if the government's policy is found to be unlawful, migrants will be brought back to the UK. The Prime Minister says he knew it would always be a long process.
When I first announced the policy, I said it would take a long time to get going, and there would be plenty of legal challenges, there would be bumps on the road. But I think what opponents of the policy have to say is, well, what is your alternative? What is your alternative to people being shipped across the channel in very frail, unseaworthy dinghies, risking their lives and undermining the rule of law?
Scotland's First Minister says there is an indisputable mandate for a second referendum on Scotland's independence from the United Kingdom. Speaking in Edinburgh, Nicola Sturgeon said it would allow for a wealthier, fairer and more resilient nation. She says people in Scotland are suffering from many implications of a Brexit they did not vote for. Scotland previously held a referendum in 2014 on the issue, with 55% of the country voting against independence. The Foreign Secretary says the EU has absolutely no reason to retaliate against government plans to override the Northern Ireland Protocol. The EU has threatened legal action if the changes go ahead, and Ireland's Foreign Affairs Minister, Simon Coveney, warned it could destabilise peace in Northern Ireland. The government claims the new rules will make it easier for goods to travel there from Great Britain. Ahead of 3 days of national rail strikes next week, Downing Street's accusing rail unions of moving forward with industrial action without proper negotiations. Well, as more than 6,000 staff at Network Rail are to be balloted for a new set of strikes in a set of disputes over pay and conditions, the government says it's doing everything possible to encourage unions to step back. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound is 1.203 to the dollar. The pound is 1.153 to the euro. The price of gold currently stands at £1,508.23 per ounce.
Direct Bullion sponsors the Finance Report on GB News for gold and silver investment.
Thank you very much indeed, Rosie. It is 25 minutes to 4 o'clock on this Tuesday afternoon. You're watching The Briefing. We're on TV, online and, of course, on your wireless radio as well. Thank you very much indeed for your company. Now, let's talk about Scottish independence, because in possibly the least surprising news of today, Nicola Sturgeon has renewed the SNP's campaign for a Scottish independence referendum. The First Minister suggested that a Scottish government could hold a second vote without securing the permission of the UK government, which obviously might relate back to kind of Catalonia-style systems of trying to get that vote. The First Minister then went on to claim that Boris Johnson has no moral authority anywhere in the UK and therefore has no right to block a second vote. Well, as usual, we did try and get an SNP representative on the show. Unfortunately, yet again, no one was available. However, the SNP aren't the only pro-independence party in Scotland. And delighted to say that I'm joined by Neil Hanvey, who's an MP. He's an MP for the Alba party and joined us down the line. Neil, as always, in your tartan tie, thank you very much indeed for joining us this afternoon. I thought this referendum in 2014 was meant to be once in a generation. We're only 8 years on.
Well, I don't think that claim was ever substantially made. It was an opportunity rather than a limitation that was placed on it. And I think the world has transformed, certainly the UK world has transformed since that time. There have been multiple mandates expressed by the people of Scotland that they would like to revisit that question, a continued election of SNP governments, promising a further vote, particularly after the EU referendum result was completely out of step with public opinion in Scotland. So, if you look at the situation in Northern Ireland, a political generation, as far as the Good Friday Agreement is concerned, is 7 years. We're now past that time. So it's absolutely the right time to push. In fact, many of us, including myself, have been impatient for progress on this for some time. So I'm delighted that the First Minister has fired the starting gun on independence. And I'm delighted that we'll be able to begin the conversation, which, of course, we started in the Alba party some months ago with our We Alba book, which sets out a broad case for Scottish independence. So any further information to bring to the debate is welcome.
But instead of that, Neil, it's interesting you brought up Northern Ireland there. You're right that a referendum could be held every 7 years, according to the agreement. But that referendum would only happen if the Secretary of State decided that it was likely that the constitutional arrangement would change. Now, that's not the case in Scotland, is it? Polls are essentially saying it's 50-50. It's a dead heat. I think in the most recent poll, no, we're just ahead, but it's a statistical dead heat. There's no evidence that Scotland wants or would vote for constitutional change.
Well, we have hovered around the 50-50 mark since 2014 as time has progressed, and there hasn't been active campaigning. Now, if you go back to, and I remember it very clearly, when Alex Salmond won that historic majority in 2011, independent support was somewhere between 26% and 30%. And because of the engagement and the vision of that campaign, argued by the Yes campaign, we were able to make significant progress. And I think that given the very difficult circumstances that the UK finds itself in now post-Brexit, with the cost of living crisis, an economic downturn looking very likely to head into recession, that this is something that we will continue to make progress. So I'm undeterred by a 50-50 split at the beginning of a new independence campaign, and I would I anticipate that would grow very rapidly, very quickly.
Well, we will see. Of course, that's up in speculation. Just finally on this, Neil, though, what I would say is there is a case to be made that Brexit has changed things. You were making that case. But will you at least recognise in many ways that Brexit has actually made Scottish independence more difficult? The arguments we're having about the border in the Irish Sea or in Northern Ireland, they're all going to be had again, aren't they, if Scotland was to become independent and join the EU, which is what essentially the SNP wants. Brexit's making Scottish independence more difficult.
Yeah, well, I'm not arguing the case for the SNP. Nicola Sturgeon has made it clear that the SNP's policy is to re-enter the European Union. That is something that is for them to argue. Our party's position is to join EFTA, which certainly the noises coming out of that part of the world are very favourable to a country of the size of Scotland, with the economic potential of Scotland to gain membership of EFTA quite swiftly. And that would resolve any border problems with the UK, because, of course, the UK already has a relationship with EFTA, and so I wouldn't anticipate there being any particular difficulties with cross-border trade.
So, Neil Hanvey, as always, appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for joining us there, the Alba MP down the line from Westminster. Thank you, Neil. Let's return to our top story. That, of course, is Rwanda. This flight that's due to take off looks like at most 7 people could be on board it later on this afternoon. Still the possibility it might not take off at all. Let's speak to Anne Whittaker, who joins us down the line. And as always, thank you for joining us. This morning, the archbishops or the bishops of England were claiming this is immoral and it sends the worst possible signal about Britain abroad.
Yes, well, they've been saying that ever since the policy was announced. If you remember, the Archbishop of Canterbury decided that it was, and I quote, ungodly when it was very first announced. But the fact is that the bishops can't come up with any optional policy that will stop the deaths in the Channel, that will stop the people trafficking and stop the unlawful trade in human beings. They're not coming up with any options. This, I believe, will work. Now, there's only going to be a handful of people, if that, going today. That doesn't matter. Once it becomes regular, and once the numbers of those being sent to Rwanda grow, then the deterrent effect will be felt. And that is what this is about. It's about deterrence. At the moment, there's no deterrence because nobody's actually gone back. Now, the instant you send even half a dozen back, you're sending out a different message.
They've got no alternative. I mean, they do in the sense that they say actually just offer up safe routes. Yes, it might mean more asylum seekers coming to seek asylum here in Britain. The numbers may well, of course, go up. But frankly, if you offered safe passage, it would stop the criminal gangs and it would stop people crossing the Channel because they could get into the UK safely. This is all about numbers, frankly, isn't it, Anne? This is all about the fact that people aren't comfortable with lots of people seeking asylum in the UK.
Well, first of all, let's look at the safe passage route. Supposing you're an Afghan interpreter, the Taliban going to let you seek a safe passage? You've got to get out of the country first. That's because you would be genuinely desperate. You would be a genuine asylum seeker, not an economic migrant. Now, the fact is that the people coming across the Channel, by definition, are coming from France, where they've often been for months on end, perfectly safe country, under the rule of law, signed up to every last refugee convention that we are also signed up to. So there is no good reason why those migrants should not have sought asylum in France. But of course, the reason that they don't do that is because most of their cases are extremely flimsy, unlikely to be accepted by France, which has got quite a tough view. And therefore they try to get unlawfully into Britain because we've sent out a message. And that message is, if you get into Britain, you're very, very unlikely ever to be removed. Why? No national identity cards, flourishing underground economy, all too easy to disappear.
Fascinating, actually, that lots of people say one of the ways you could deal with all of this, and one of the reasons that migrants do want to leave places like France, is through a national ID card system. I mean, do you think we should look at that again? Because it would prevent people from able to seek work in the kind of underground jobs market or the dark economy.
Yeah, I've been in favour of national identity cards right from the start. And the interesting thing is that every single Home Secretary, even if he or she began off opposed to national identity cards, in the end has seen the merit of them because they do make a lot of things easier. And one of the things they make easier is immigration control. I've never bought into the civil liberties argument because I have a passport, I have a driving licence, I have work ID, I have this, I have that. And so the idea that a national identity card somehow infringes my civil liberties, I think is farcical.
Very finally, Anne, you know, on this point about kind of global Britain, it's going to be one of the kind of big things about Brexit, isn't it? Do you think this harms our reputation abroad, irrespective of the rights and wrongs of it, that it sends out a message that actually Britain isn't necessarily terribly welcoming or terribly compassionate? Is that a potential negative byproduct of this policy?
I don't think so, though I understand why you asked the question. I don't think so, for the very simple reason that this is a last resort taken in order to save lives. So I don't think that that is actually going to be the message that goes out. And indeed, to a certain extent, that's up to the government and how it puts this policy across.
Anne Whittaker, as always, with the best bookshelf in Britain down there in Kent. Thank you very much, as always, for joining us. Thank you, Anne. OK, let's turn now to the Falklands War, because it's 40 years since the liberation of the Falklands Islands after the Argentinian invasion of 1982. The battle to win back the British South Atlantic territory lasted 74 days and cost the lives of 255 British servicemen. Nearly 800 were injured. Hundreds of Argentinian troops were, of course, also killed in the conflict. Well, events are being held on the islands and here in the UK to commemorate the end of the war. Now, Home Affairs and Security Editor Mark White has been looking back at its legacy.
It was a huge gamble, dispatching a military task force 8,000 miles into the South Atlantic winter. But for Margaret Thatcher's government, recapturing the Falklands was a political imperative. After 74 days under Argentinian control, the islands were finally liberated on the 14th of June 1982. But not before a heavy toll on both sides, with more than 250 British servicemen killed, almost 650 Argentinian losses, the deaths of 3 islanders, and a local population left deeply traumatised.
This was the kind of kit that really alarmed us because it was very heavy armour, and you can see that there's a turret there with at least a .5-inch machine gun, if not a cannon, and these were grinding through our streets.
Graham Bound was a young photojournalist in April 1982, running the local newspaper in Port Stanley, when he was suddenly faced with the scoop of a lifetime, an invading Argentinian army. Many of the images he captured during those months of conflict are being seen publicly for the first time, part of a fascinating exhibition at the Chatham Naval Dockyard. Images that of course document the military operation, but also the plight of a captive population caught in the middle of a violent struggle to retake the islands.
These Argentines are being rounded up by British troops. You can see, I think, Paras or Marines doing their best to round them up and at the same time getting these men to clear up a little bit. But the mess was unspeakable. This was one of our general stores here, which had been torched and was gone, but the smoke was still lingering. And when I look at these, I can almost still smell them. It was just a complete scene out of hell, frankly.
It was the day of the Vulcan bombing of Stanley Airfield that we heard HMS Hermes trying to get through to the Argentine High Command to offer terms of surrender.
Saul Pitaluga was a teenager at the time of the invasion when he and his father were captured by the Argentinians as they tried to relay a radio message from the British task force to the Argentinian command.
Long story short, they arrested my dad and took him into Stanley for some fairly rigorous questioning, and including having a gun held to his head and the mechanism being clicked to try and sort of extract more information.
By the time the Argentinians surrendered, along with the hundreds killed, the British had lost half a dozen ships and more than 30 aircraft.
4 decades on from the Falklands War, the lessons learned from that conflict have been used to help shape and improve the UK's military. Destroyers and frigates are now much better protected from air and missile strikes, and it's the reason why we now have 2 super carriers, 3 times bigger than the Falklands-era aircraft carriers, better able to protect the fleet.
As the sacrifices in this pivotal military campaign are remembered, Graham Bound is anxious that the islanders, who also suffered, are not forgotten.
It's a thing quite near to my heart because I actually think that everybody just had to pick themselves up and carry on. I look at these guys, both of whom are now gone, and I'm quite proud of them, and I think they did a really good job. I wish they weren't perhaps a little bit forgotten.
There you go, Mark White with that report. Of course, we've seen a memorial service effectively at the National Arboretum in Staffordshire today. The Prime Minister's been there, saw a fly past a little bit earlier on, remembering 40 years on from the liberation of the Falklands. OK, joining me in the studio, talk a little bit about that and other things coming up on this programme is Colin Brazier, of course, on air in about 10 minutes' time from 4 to 6. Colin, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Dan.
You've been to the Falklands.
late 1990s with the Prince of Wales. Well, I was with the media following the Prince of Wales. Beautiful, long way away.
It's a long way away.
Long way away. But that was... I mean, people say, could we do it now? Would we even want to? Would we even attempt to do it now? That idea of asserting the rights of, 3,000 people, their sovereignty, at so much cost in blood and treasure? I don't know. Have we got the wherewithal? Probably not.
Well, but then it's fascinating that if it wasn't what it seems, without Margaret Thatcher, it probably wouldn't have happened, actually. In the end, she was kind of push first. Go on.
Well, it's one of the reasons for those people who still have... We were talking about this actually yesterday in the context of Tony Blair and why people hate him so much. And Charles Moore in the Telegraph last week said there's a relatively new thing in British politics, which is this hatred for former prime ministers. And you see it in this visceral attitude, sometimes towards Tony Blair. You get it certainly with Thatcher, my late wife, who would say Margaret Thatcher, and it was like a reflexive, the knee bone would go. And part of it comes back to the Falklands and some of the decisions that she took, not least thinking of the General Belgrano, that people still remember and invoke as this example of just how iniquitous she was. She wasn't. She was a leader who had to make tough choices at the time.
Well, I think we can go briefly now to Mark White, our Home Affairs and Security Editor. You saw his report just there. He is in Staffordshire at the National Arboretum, where that memorial has been taking place today. Mark, just talk us through what's been happening there today. We saw the Prime Minister a little bit earlier on.
Yes, well, quite rightly, people paying their respects, commemorating the sacrifices of those 255 servicemen who died during the Falklands War, remembering the great endeavour. And it was fascinating listening to your conversation there with Colin about this task force of 30,000 servicemen and some civilians, more than 100 vessels that sailed into a South Atlantic winter. Could it be done again? Well, the Prime Minister, who was here and speaking today, was asked that very question. He said he believed that, yes, Britain could mount a daring mission like this again. They have now, which they didn't have then, 2 super carriers, aircraft carriers, HMS Queen Elizabeth, HMS Prince of Wales, 3 times bigger than the Invincible class aircraft carriers used in Falklands. And of course, the development of these new aircraft carriers was brought about because of the experiences learned in the Falklands, the need for more deck space so that you could have your jet aircraft, your Harriers then, now F-35 jet fighters, and they could mount an effective, what they call combat air patrol cap over the task force to ensure that the Argentinians, as was then, but any future enemy, is kept well enough away from the task force. So he does believe that the British military has the wherewithal to carry out an equally ambitious mission again if they were called upon, despite the fact, of course, that the strength of the army now is half of what it was back in 1982.
Mark White, I know you'll be following that, and you will be for the rest of the day there in Staffordshire. Thank you very much indeed, Home Affairs and Security Editor Mark White joining us in the studio. Now, Colin Brazier, who is here to talk to me about what's coming up on the programme, he's gone over there to the other side of the studio. But I can tell you by looking at his menu of what's coming up, he's going to be talking about the Falklands. He's going to be talking about Rwanda, which is he's going to come over. He's running over here. He's got about 20 seconds to tell me. And you've got Robert Fox on, haven't you?
Isn't he? He's great, Robert Fox, isn't he? He's one of those defence correspondents who's seen it and done it all, and he's still got a real grasp of what's happening in places like Ukraine right now. I want to get into Scottish independence now as well. Okay. Can I? I've got 20 seconds.
You've got 20 seconds.
There is a point that's often neglected, I think, in this conversation, and that is the views of people, I don't know about you, Northern Irishmen, but as an Englishman, I'm a Brit first and an Englishman second. And I feel since 2014, non-Scottish Brits have not done enough to challenge the surge towards separatism.
Big discussion point. Colin's coming up in just a couple of minutes. That's it from me for today. I'm back, of course, at 3 tomorrow. Up next, it's the weather, and my word, it's looking hot towards the end of the week. See you tomorrow.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather update. Warm and sunny today, and we're going to go to hot and sunny by the end of the week. It's not dry and sunny everywhere, however. Still got a few showers in the far northwest over the Highlands of Scotland, the Western Isles, and at times the Northern Isles. Maybe the odd shower for Northern Ireland this evening as well. But for most places, it's dry through this evening. It's going to be a dry and a clear night as well. Temperatures in rural spots could drop down into single figures, but most towns and cities staying in double digits. A fairly warm start to what will be a very warm day. We'll be bathed in sunshine by and large. Still some patchy rain across northeast Scotland initially, and the Northern Isles always susceptible to some